The night Naomi Beckett crawled into a stranger's barn, she had exactly $3.40 to her name, a bruised left cheek from a man she would never again call her employer, and a desperate, bone-deep hunger that made the smell of hay and horse seem like the sweetest perfume she had ever encountered in all her 24 years of living. It was the autumn of 1882, deep in the heart of Texas, and the wind that swept across the open plains carried the kind of cold that didn't just chill the skin but reached inside a person and rattled their very soul. Naomi had been walking since sundown, following the wagon road south from the town of Caldwell, because north meant going back toward the Harmon Ranch, and going back toward the Harmon Ranch meant going back toward Gerald Harmon himself, and that was something she had promised herself she would never do again, not as long as her legs could carry her forward. She had worked for the Harmons for 11 months. 11 months of cooking, cleaning, laundering, mending, and every other task that a household cook and housekeeper could be asked to perform. And she had done every last bit of it well, done it better than anyone had a right to expect from a woman alone in the world with no family to speak of, and no references other than the recommendation letter she had carried from Wichita, Kansas, which was itself from a widow woman named Mrs. Clara Holt, who had since passed and could no longer speak on Naomi's behalf. The Harmons had taken her on under those circumstances, and for 11 months everything had been tolerable, if not warm. Then Gerald Harmon had come home from Abilene with whiskey on his breath and a mean look in his eye. And when Naomi had told him firmly that she was not that kind of hired help, he had raised his hand to her face, and she had grabbed her carpetbag and walked out the kitchen door, and she had not looked back once. That was why she was here, pushing open the heavy barn door of a property she did not know, stepping into the warm, dark smell of horses and old wood and sweet dried grass, and asking God's forgiveness for trespassing, while simultaneously thanking him that the door had not been locked. There were 2 horses in the stalls. A big bay gelding who turned one dark eye toward her without alarm, and a smaller roan mare who stamped a single hoof and then went back to her hay. Naomi stood in the doorway until her eyes adjusted to the darkness. Then she moved to the far corner where a generous pile of loose hay was mounded up against the wall, and she set her carpetbag down, and she sat down beside it, and she told herself she would rest for just an hour and then keep moving. She was asleep in less than 5 minutes. She did not hear the barn door open 2 hours later. She did not hear the boots on the hard-packed dirt floor, measured and careful in the way of a man who had walked through his own barn in the dark 1,000 times and knew every inch of it. She did not hear him pause, or hear the low, quiet sound he made under his breath when his lantern light swung across her face, and he saw her there, curled on her side in the hay with her carpetbag pulled tight against her chest like she was afraid someone was going to take even that away from her. David Wilcox stood very still for a long moment. He was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of a man who had spent his entire adult life doing hard physical work, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples and steady brown eyes that had a habit of taking in everything around him before he spoke or acted. He had come out to the barn because his bay gelding, Reckoning, had been favoring his right foreleg that afternoon, and David liked to check on his animals at night when something was bothering him about them. He had not expected to find a woman sleeping in the corner. He crouched down slowly, setting his lantern on the floor so the light was low and soft, and he studied her. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark brown hair that had come half loose from its pins and spread across the hay around her head. Even in sleep her brow was slightly furrowed, like whatever she was dreaming about was not entirely peaceful. There was something on her left cheek that in the lantern light looked like a bruise, and that detail made David's jaw tighten in a way he did not entirely try to suppress. She was not a vagrant. Her dress was dusty and travel-worn, but it was well-made, and her hands, folded under her chin, were the hands of someone who worked hard for a living. The carpetbag looked like it had seen better days, but it was good leather. Somebody's daughter, David thought. Somebody's someone, and she had ended up here in his barn on a cold October night, sleeping in the hay because she had nowhere else to go. He straightened up. He stood there a moment longer. Then he took off his coat, the heavy canvas one he wore for night checks, and he draped it carefully over her without waking her, and he went back to check on Reckoning's leg, and he left the lantern on its lowest setting in the corner so she would not wake up in absolute darkness and be frightened. He did not sleep much the rest of the night. By the time the first pale gray light was pressing through the cracks in the barn walls, David was already at the pump in the yard, filling the water bucket, and he had a pot of coffee going on the stove inside the house, and he had sliced bread and set out butter and jam, because whatever else the morning was going to bring, the woman in his barn was going to wake up hungry, and a hungry person deserved to eat before anything else was discussed. He heard the barn door when it opened. He was crossing the yard with the water bucket when Naomi Beckett came out, blinking in the early morning light, holding his canvas coat around her shoulders and looking like she expected to be yelled at. She saw him and she stopped walking and she squared her shoulders in the way of someone who had faced hard moments before and intended to face this one the same way. "Your coat," she said, pulling it off and holding it toward him. "I apologize for using it. I apologize for being in your barn at all. I will be on my way." Her voice was steady, but there was a slight roughness to it, the kind that came from having cried recently and then stopped, and David noticed it the same way he noticed the bruise on her cheek, which was clearly a bruise in the morning light, dark purple at the center and greenish at the edges. "Where are you headed?" he asked. He did not take the coat. He set the bucket down and he looked at her directly, not unkindly. Naomi blinked. She had clearly been bracing for something different. "South," she said after a moment. "Toward San Marcos, maybe. I have some money." "How much money?" She pressed her lips together like she did not appreciate the question, which David respected. "Enough," she said. "It's 18 miles to San Marcos," he said. "On foot, through open country with nothing along the way that I know of. I have walked longer distances." "I don't doubt it." He picked up the coat she was holding out and he draped it over his arm rather than putting it on, and he nodded toward the house. "Come inside. There's coffee and breakfast. Whatever happened last night, you can eat first and deal with it after." She looked at the house and then at him, and David understood what she was calculating. He was a stranger, a man and a larger one than her, alone on a property with no neighbors in sight. He understood exactly why she was hesitating and he did not rush her. "My name is David Wilcox," he said. "I've had this ranch for 7 years. The nearest neighbor is the Caldwell family, about a mile east. The town of Myra Creek is 4 miles north. You are welcome to eat breakfast and then walk to town if you prefer, or I can hitch up the wagon and take you wherever you're going. I'm not asking you to do anything except come inside and eat something before you fall over." Something in her expression shifted. Not trust, exactly, not yet, but the recognition that he had said what needed to be said without being asked, and that counted for something. "Naomi Beckett," she said. "That is my name." "Pleased to meet you, Miss Beckett," David said, and he meant it. Inside the kitchen, which was a large, plain room with a good stove and a solid table and evidence everywhere of a man who lived alone and managed adequately but without any particular comfort, Naomi sat down and wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee, and David set bread and butter and a jar of last summer's strawberry preserves on the table, and then he put a cast iron pan on the stove and cracked 4 eggs into it without asking whether she wanted them, because of course she wanted them. For a little while neither of them spoke, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. Naomi ate with the careful dignity of someone who was very hungry but was not going to show it more than she could help, and David drank his coffee and watched the yard through the window the way he always did in the morning, reading the weather and the light and the state of things. "Who hit you?" he asked when she had finished the eggs and was working on a second piece of bread with jam. She did not flinch. "My employer," she said. "Former employer as of last night. The Harmon Ranch." She looked at him sharply. "You know him?" "Know of him," David said. Gerald Harmon, I've heard things. He paused. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm not looking for sympathy, Naomi said, but the way she said it was not harsh, just honest. I am looking for a way forward. I'm a good cook and housekeeper. I have experience. I just need to find a new position somewhere that isn't within 40 miles of Gerald Harmon. That's reasonable, David said. He refilled her coffee without asking and she let him. What's in San Marcos? Nothing specific. I just kept walking south last night and that's the town I knew the name of. David was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee mug in his hands, a slow, thoughtful movement. Outside the window, the sun was beginning to properly rise now, painting the brown grass of the pasture in shades of gold and amber, and the horses were moving in the corral, easy and unhurried, and the whole morning had that particular quality of stillness and possibility that David had always found most characteristic of this land he loved. I have a proposal, he said. He kept his voice level, because he wanted her to be able to think about what he was going to say without feeling any kind of pressure behind it. I'm not saying this because I feel sorry for you, because you don't seem like a woman who wants to be felt sorry for. I'm saying it because it happens to be practically true. This ranch runs better with 2 people than 1. I've got 30 head of cattle, 2 horses, 4 hogs, and enough chickens to need managing. I do all the cooking myself, which I am not good at. The house, as you can see, is functional but not what it could be. I'm not suggesting anything improper. I have a spare room. It has a proper door with a latch on the inside. You could stay on as hired help, room and board plus fair wages, while you figure out what your next step is. Naomi looked at him for a long time. It was the kind of looking that David understood as real consideration, not suspicion, just a careful woman measuring a careful offer. Why? She asked simply. Because you needed a barn last night and ended up in mine, he said, and that seems like as good a reason as any. It was not the most eloquent thing he had ever said, but it was the truest, and Naomi seemed to understand the difference. 1 month, she said. I'll stay 1 month and we'll see how the arrangement suits us both. That's fair, David said. They shook hands across the breakfast table, and that was how it began. The spare room turned out to be a good-sized space at the back of the house, with a window that looked east toward the rise of land that caught the morning sun, and a wooden bed frame with a mattress that was old but sound, and a washstand with a ceramic pitcher and basin that had a blue flower pattern on it, which seemed like a small, strange grace note in an otherwise very plain house. Naomi stood in the doorway and looked at the room, and David stood behind her in the hallway and waited. It's fine, she said. It's more than fine. I'll get you some extra blankets, he said. Nights get cold fast in October. She brought in her carpet bag, and she closed the door, and David went back outside to start the morning's work. And he spent the better part of that first hour doing nothing particularly useful, because his mind kept drifting back to the table and the coffee, and the way she had looked at him when she asked why, and how the question had been so direct and uncomplicated, and how he had liked that, genuinely liked it, in a way he could not entirely account for. By mid-morning, Naomi had assessed the kitchen with the systematic thoroughness of a professional and informed David, with the kind of bluntness that he was beginning to understand, was simply how she communicated, that his flour barrel was developing weevils, his salt pork was adequate but could be stretched further with proper planning, and that whatever he had been using to season the beans was not sufficient. I need to go into town, she said, for supplies. I was planning to go day after tomorrow, David said. I'll take you. I'd rather not wait 2 days to fix the flour situation. He looked at her. She looked back at him. He hitched up the wagon. The drive to Myra Creek took the better part of an hour, through country that was flat and wide, and interrupted every so often by clusters of mesquite and live oak that stood against the horizon like small determined armies. Naomi sat on the wagon seat beside David, and she looked out at the land with the expression of someone who was genuinely seeing it for the first time, taking it in with the kind of attention that suggested she had been indoors for a long time and had forgotten how large the world was. "How long have you been in Texas?" David asked, "About a year," she said. "I came from Kansas, Wichita. What brought you down here?" She was quiet for a moment, watching a hawk circle high above the brown grass to the south. "Work," she said, and the idea that things might be different somewhere new. She paused. "They were different, not always better, but different." David nodded. He understood that particular logic well enough. He had come to Texas from Missouri himself in 1875, when he was 24 years old, and the land in Missouri felt like it had someone else's name on it already, like everything he might want from life was going to require going somewhere that hadn't already been claimed by the men who came before him. "What made you pick here?" she asked. "This particular piece of land?" "The creek," he said. "There's a creek that runs along the eastern edge of the property. Good water. And the grass was better than what I'd seen elsewhere. Also, honestly, I ran out of money before I got any further south, and the land was priced at something I could actually manage." She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, and it was a good sound, genuine and unguarded, and it changed her face entirely, chased away the careful measuring look, and replaced it with something younger and lighter. "That is a very honest answer," she said. "I try to be honest," he said. "I find it saves time in the long run." In town, Naomi moved through the general store with the efficient precision of someone who had been managing household provisions under tight budgets for a long time. She compared prices and quantities, asked the storekeeper, a red-faced man named Alderman, pointed questions about the quality of his current flour stock, and selected items with a decisiveness that made David realize that whatever else was uncertain about this arrangement, she genuinely knew her work. He watched her from across the store while pretending to look at a display of rope near the door. She was not a woman who was easily rattled, he thought. She had spent the night in a stranger's barn after being struck by her employer, had walked into another stranger's kitchen and eaten his eggs and negotiated an employment arrangement, all within the space of 8 hours, and she was now standing in the general store of a town she had never been to before, moving through it like she owned the place. He respected that enormously. The storekeeper, Alderman, noticed David watching and gave him a look that was half amusement and half speculation, and David pretended not to see it and went back to examining the rope. On the drive home, with the wagon bed loaded with flour and salt, and a small sack of dried chilies that Naomi had added to the list with a look that dared him to object, she asked him about the ranch and he told her. He had bought the land for $40 and built the house himself, starting with just a single room and a sleeping loft, expanding as the cattle herd grew and the money allowed. He had put in the corral and the barn in the second year, and the smokehouse in the third. He had a small garden plot that he maintained without much enthusiasm, because he understood that vegetables were necessary, but had never found them interesting in the way he found cattle interesting. "You should plant fruit trees," she said. "Peach trees do well in this part of Texas. Then you'd have preserves." "Is that something you know about, fruit trees?" "My mother grew peaches," she said, and the way she said it was careful, the way people said things that belonged to a part of their past they were protective of. She knew everything about them. He did not ask about her mother, not then. He would learn, over the weeks that followed, that Naomi's mother had died when Naomi was 17, and her father 2 years before that, and that she had made her own way in the world since then with nothing but her own capabilities and a stubbornness that was, in his eventual assessment, one of the most admirable qualities a person could possess. The first week of the arrangement settled into a rhythm with a naturalness that surprised them both. David rose before dawn to start the outdoor work, tending the cattle and the horses and the hogs, checking fences, doing the 1,000 small tasks that a working ranch required. By the time he came in at mid-morning, there was always something on the stove that smelled better than anything he had managed to produce in the 7 years he'd lived in that kitchen. And there was always coffee, proper coffee, not the thin, overboiled version he'd been making himself. Naomi cooked with authority and creativity, which was impressive given that she was working with limited supplies and a pantry that had been, before her arrival, somewhat haphazard. The first evening she made a beef stew that used the dried chilies in a way that made the broth deep and complex and rich, and David ate 2 full bowls of it and then sat back in his chair and looked at her across the table with an expression that he could not entirely organize. "This is remarkable," he said. "It's a reasonable stew," she said, but she looked pleased. "No," he said, "it's remarkable." After supper, they had developed an unconscious habit of sitting on the front porch for a while before turning in, watching the dark come down across the land. It was a big darkness out here, not the close, pressing dark of a town, but an open, breathing dark that was full of sounds. Coyotes somewhere to the west, the creek murmuring if the wind was right, the occasional lowing of cattle in the far pasture. They talked on those evenings, sometimes a great deal and sometimes very little, but either way David found himself looking forward to that hour in a way he had not looked forward to an evening in a very long time. She told him about Wichita, about working in a boarding house there from the time she was 18, about learning to cook from a woman named Esperanza who had come up from Mexico and knew things about food that no one else in that boarding house had known, and about how she had eventually decided to go further afield when the man who owned the boarding house sold it and the new owner brought his own staff. David told her about Missouri, about his father's farm that had gone to his older brother as was the custom, about his own years of drifting before Texas, working cattle drives and ranch jobs up and down the plains, saving carefully and learning everything he could about land and livestock and the business of making a life from scratch. "Did you ever think about going back?" she asked one evening. "To Missouri?" "When things were hard in the beginning sometimes," he said, "but this is mine. Everything on this land, I built it or I bought it or I planted it. That feeling is something I didn't want to give up." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I understand that," she said. "I've never had that feeling, something that was entirely mine." "What would you want?" he asked. He said it without thinking, a genuine question, and he felt her stillness after he said it, the quality of attention she gave to the question rather than deflecting it. "A garden," she said finally. "A real one, and a kitchen that I knew I could be in indefinitely, a place where I could put my things down and know they were going to stay there." He looked at her in the dim evening light, at the clean line of her profile against the darkening sky, and he felt something in his chest that he did not quite have words for yet, but that was warm and specific, and not at all unpleasant. "That doesn't seem like too much to ask," he said quietly. The second week, Naomi discovered the root cellar, which David had not been maintaining properly, and she spent an entire day reorganizing it and making an inventory, and she presented him with a written list of what was there and what was needed before winter, and he read it twice and then looked up at her standing in the kitchen doorway with flour on her apron and a pencil still tucked behind her ear. "You run a tighter operation than I do," he said. "A household is an operation," she said simply. "I mean that as a compliment," he said. She took the pencil from behind her ear and tapped it against her palm thoughtfully. "We should get another half-quart of wood before the first hard freeze," she said, "and the smokehouse needs rechinked on the south wall where the wind gets through." "I know about the smokehouse," he said. "I've been meaning to get to it." "It should happen before you smoke the autumn hogs," she said, practical and direct. "You're right," he said. He rechinked the smokehouse the next morning. He was not sure he would have done it quite so promptly had she not been there to make it a specific and immediate concern, rather than a vague future task, and that small realization sat with him in an interesting way while he worked, the mortar cold in his hands, the autumn sun warm on his back. That afternoon he came in for the midday meal and found her in the garden plot, which he had left fallow and weedy at the end of summer, pulling dead growth and turning the soil with the garden fork. She had tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and her cheeks were flushed from the work, and there was dirt on her hands and forearms, and she looked, David thought, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. He stood at the edge of the garden for a moment before she noticed him. "I thought I'd clear it before the ground freezes too hard," she said, pushing the fork into the soil and leaning on the handle. "If you were planning to use it for spring planting, it's better to prepare it now." "Were you planning to be here for spring planting?" he asked, and he kept his voice easy and neutral because it was a genuine question, and he did not want her to feel like there was an expectation attached to it. She met his eyes. There was a pause that lasted just a beat longer than a purely practical response would require. "I hadn't decided yet," she said. "Fair enough," he said, and he went to wash up for the midday meal, and neither of them mentioned it again that day. What was happening between them was slow and careful, and neither of them talked about it directly, because they were both people who had learned to move through the world with a certain wariness, who had found that things offered too quickly tended to disappear just as fast. But it was there, real and growing, in the way they had begun to anticipate each other's presence, in the way David found himself noticing the exact shade of her eyes in different kinds of light, which was hazel, green when she was laughing, brown when she was thinking hard, and something warmer when she was tired, and in the way Naomi found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the porch steps at the end of the day, with a feeling that she did not examine too closely, but that was undeniable. The third week brought the first real cold front of autumn, a north wind that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in an afternoon and drove a thin, bitter rain sideways across the open land. David brought the hogs into the barn and checked the cattle in the far pasture and came home at dusk soaked through and cold to the bone, and Naomi had the stove going full and a pot of beans on and cornbread baking in the Dutch oven, and she took one look at him standing in the kitchen doorway and said, "Sit down and take those wet boots off before you track mud through my kitchen." "Your kitchen," he said, but he was smiling when he said it. "My kitchen," she confirmed, with equal certainty and a look that was entirely without apology. He sat down and took his boots off, and she brought him hot coffee and stood at the stove while he drank it, and she did not make a fuss about how wet he was or how cold. She just managed it, quietly and efficiently, the way she managed everything, and David thought that he had not felt taken care of like this since he could not remember when. "My mother used to do that," he said, meaning the boots and the coffee, and then he felt slightly embarrassed by the comparison. Naomi did not seem to find it embarrassing. "Tell me about her," she said. So he told her about his mother, David Wilcox, who had been a small, fierce woman with an enormous garden and absolute opinions about the right way to do everything from making bread to shoeing horses, and who had died of a fever when David was 22, 2 years before he left Missouri. And Naomi listened the way she always listened, with her full attention, and she asked questions that were the right questions, and somewhere in the middle of talking about his mother, David realized that Naomi Beckett was the first person he had talked to in a long, long time who actually listened to him the way he found himself listening to her. The rain kept up through the night and into the next day, and there was nothing to be done outside that could not wait. So David spent the morning at the table doing accounts, and Naomi spent it baking, and the kitchen was warm and fragrant with bread and cinnamon. And at some point in the afternoon, they had drifted into a conversation about books, which revealed that they had both, in the lean years of their separate lives, gotten their hands on the same dog-eared copy of a collected works of Shakespeare through different routes, and had both particularly loved the same play, which was not the one either of them expected the other to name. "The Tempest," David said, slightly astonished. "The Tempest," Naomi confirmed with a smile that was slow and delighted. "Not Hamlet, not Romeo and Juliet. I like a story about someone building something out of a difficult situation," she said, "creating order from chaos, finding a way through. That is exactly why I like it," he said. They stared at each other across the table for a moment, and the rain came down against the window, and the stove ticked and breathed, and the whole afternoon had a quality of suspension that David felt in his chest and did not know what to do with except sit very still and not interrupt. That evening, after supper, David went to the small shelf in the main room where he kept the few books he owned, and he found the volume he had been looking for, a collected works that was old and spine-cracked but intact, and he brought it to the table and set it in front of Naomi without saying anything. She opened it and turned to The Tempest, and she ran her fingertip along the first line of the first page, and the expression on her face was one that David thought he would remember for the rest of his life. "Where did you get this?" she asked softly. "Book peddler about 3 years ago. I paid more than I should have for it." "No," she said. "You paid exactly the right amount." The last week of October brought a clear spell, cold nights but bright, still days, and it was during this spell that the incident with the Dunmore brothers occurred, which was the most trouble David had experienced in several years, and which brought things between him and Naomi to a clarity that neither of them had quite anticipated. The Dunmore brothers were 3 men, rough-edged and itinerant, who had been drifting around the county for most of the summer, taking what they could from smaller operations. David had heard about them in town. He had not expected them to show up at his property on a Tuesday afternoon, while he was in the south pasture checking on a heifer that had been slow to recover from a minor injury, and Naomi was alone at the house. She heard them before she saw them. 3 horses coming up the road at a pace that was too deliberate to be casual. She stepped onto the porch and she watched them come, and her face, which David would have described as always carrying a quiet readiness, became particularly still. The oldest of the brothers, a broad man with a beard going gray, stopped his horse at the gate and looked her over in a way that was rude and measuring. "We're looking for the man of the place," he said. "He'll be back shortly," Naomi said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "We'll wait then, and while we wait, maybe you could see your way to some hospitality." "I'm afraid not," Naomi said. "You can wait by the gate." The man looked at her for a long moment, and Naomi did not blink. Then he laughed, a sound without warmth, and said something to his brothers that Naomi could not hear. She walked back into the house and she got David's rifle from the rack by the door, which she knew how to use because Esperanza in Wichita had taught her as a practical matter the same way she had taught her to make proper chili, and she walked back to the porch and she set it across her forearms in a way that was not threatening exactly but was absolutely clear. "I said by the gate," she repeated. The man looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. He backed his horse up 3 steps. That was how David found them when he came back from the south pasture 20 minutes later, the 3 Dunmore brothers sitting their horses beyond his gate, looking put out, and Naomi standing on the porch with his rifle and an expression of absolute calm. He read the situation in about 4 seconds. He rode reckoning between the brothers and the gate, and he told the brothers, in a voice that was quiet and completely without inflection, that they were on his land without invitation and he was asking them to leave, and that if they came back, he would report them to the county sheriff, whose name he mentioned specifically, because he knew the man personally and the brothers were evidently aware of the name. They left. David dismounted and walked to the porch, and he looked at Naomi holding his rifle, and he felt, simultaneously, a profound admiration and a tightness in his chest that he recognized as having been frightened on her behalf without knowing it, the retrospective fear that arrives after the danger has passed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. She handed him the rifle. "They were trying to see if I could be pushed. I made sure they understood I couldn't." "Where did you learn to handle a rifle?" "A woman I worked for in Wichita," she said. "She said every woman alone in the world should know how." "She was right," David said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I should have thought about it sooner, leaving you here alone without any means of protection. You left me in a house with a rifle rack," Naomi said. "That was sufficient." He ran a hand through his hair and looked out toward the gate where the dust of the brothers' departure was still settling. "I don't like that it happened," he said. "I know," she said, "but it's settled. Come inside, the stew is going to be ready in an hour." He came inside. But he sat at the table while she moved around the kitchen, and he watched her, and he thought about what it meant that she had been there, capable and steady and unafraid, and what the house would feel like if she were not in it. And the thought was so specific and unwelcome that he got up and went back outside to put reckoning in the corral, where he could think without her noticing the expression on his face. In November, the weather turned seriously cold, and the work on the ranch shifted accordingly. There was less to do outdoors, but it was harder work in the cold, and there was more to do indoors, the serious business of preserving and smoking and laying in supplies for winter. Naomi and David fell into the habit of working alongside each other in the evenings, she at the table doing mending or organizing the household accounts, he at the other end doing the ranch accounts or reading, and they talked as they worked, easy conversations that wandered from one subject to another without particular purpose, and arrived at the end of the evening having covered an enormous amount of ground. She told him about a woman she had known in the first boarding house she'd worked at in Wichita, a woman named Dolers who had saved every spare cent for 3 years and eventually bought herself a small piece of land in Kansas and grown the best tomatoes anyone had ever tasted. She was the freest person I ever knew, Naomi said, because she had something that was hers. Is that what you want? David asked. A piece of land. I used to think I didn't have the right to want something that large, she said. She paused, smoothing the fabric she was mending with the flat of her hand. I think I've started to reconsider that. He looked at her across the table. You should, he said. You have every right. She met his eyes, and there was something in that exchange that they both felt, a current of something large and specific, and neither of them quite knew what to do with it yet. So they went back to their respective tasks, and the stove ticked, and the wind pressed at the windows, and the evening slid quietly by. It was the second week of November when David first acknowledged to himself, clearly and without evasion, that he was in love with Naomi Beckett. He was riding the east fence line in the early morning, and the light was coming up pink and cold over the creek, and he was thinking about the way she had looked the previous evening when she was reading the Shakespeare, which she had claimed on the grounds that he had already read it and she hadn't yet had sufficient time with it. And he was thinking about the particular quality of her attention when she read, the way she was so entirely present in whatever she was engaged with. And he realized that he had been cataloging these details about her for weeks, collecting them the way some people collected significant objects, because they mattered to him in a way that went well beyond any reasonable employment relationship. He sat on reckoning for a while, looking at the creek, which was low in the November cold but still moving, a thin bright thread through the winter grass. He was not a man who moved quickly with things like this. He had been careful his whole adult life, with land and with money and with people, and that carefulness had served him well. But he was also, fundamentally, an honest person, and the dishonesty of pretending to himself that what he felt for Naomi was simple appreciation for a good worker, or the pleasant comfort of company after years of solitude, was becoming harder to maintain. He rode back to the house and he came in for breakfast and she was at the stove, and she looked up when he came in and said, "Coffee's fresh." And he sat down and she brought it and he said, "Thank you." And their hands were close on the mug for a moment and she pulled back first. The first frost of real consequence arrived on a Wednesday night, the kind that glazed every surface with a thin, silver shell and made the morning world look both beautiful and severe. David broke the ice on the water troughs before anything else, and Naomi heated water on the stove for washing, and they moved through the frosty morning efficiently, and then sat down to breakfast in the warm kitchen, and the contrast between the cold outside and the warmth inside was as sharp and pleasant as it always was on those early winter mornings. "I've been thinking," Naomi said, which was her habitual way of beginning a conversation that she had clearly been organizing for some time. "Tell me," David said. "My month is up," she said. "More than up, actually. It's been 6 weeks." He set down his coffee cup. "I know." "I should tell you what I'm thinking about the arrangement," she said. She looked at the table rather than at him, which was unusual for her. "I'd like to stay, if that's still offered." "It's still offered," he said immediately. She looked up then. I want you to know it isn't just practicality, she said, and that sentence was clearly costing her something, the way you could tell when something was costing Naomi Beckett because she held herself slightly more still. It's more than that. I'm aware of that. The kitchen was very quiet. The frost outside made even the morning sound seem muted, the cattle further away than they were. I'm glad, David said. He said it simply, because he had always found that the simplest words carried the most. She nodded once, a small, precise movement, and then she said, "Now, can you tell me where exactly you want the herb garden because I want to plant it before the ground freezes completely?" He laughed, and she allowed herself a smile that was private and warm and directed at her coffee cup, and he thought he had never been so entirely certain of anything in his life. It was the third week of November when David rode into Myra Creek on a morning when Naomi had said she needed things from the store and he had said he would go. And he had done the errands, and he had also stopped at the small jewelry counter at the back of the general store, where Alderman kept a glass case with a few modest items, mostly things that came through from San Antonio or Austin, rings and brooches, and the occasional pocket watch. He stood at the counter for a long time. Alderman came over and looked at him with an expression that managed to be both discreet and knowing, which was the expression of a general store owner who had seen enough of human life to understand what a man standing at a jewelry counter in November was probably thinking about. There was a ring in the case, a simple gold band with a small garnet set into it, the stone a deep red that caught the light and held it. It was not elaborate. It was the kind of ring that said what it needed to say without being extravagant about it. David thought about Naomi and her practicality and her honesty and her directness, and he thought that this ring suited the woman he knew far better than anything more showy would. "How much for that one?" he asked, pointing. Alderman named the price. David thought about it for exactly 5 seconds and said he would take it. He carried it home in his coat pocket, and for 2 days he thought about when and how to have the conversation he needed to have. And for 2 days he found that every time he thought he had worked it out satisfactorily, the actual presence of Naomi herself disrupted all his carefully prepared language, because she was not a person who could be easily approached with prepared language. She had a way of seeing through the preparation directly to the substance underneath, which he usually found admirable and which was currently somewhat inconvenient. It was a Friday evening. They had eaten supper, and the dishes were done, and they were in their usual places in the main room, she with the mending and he with a report on market prices for cattle that he had been meaning to read for a week. The stove was warm, and the lamp on the table was burning low and golden, and outside the wind was working its way around the corners of the house, with a sound that was less threatening than companionable on a night when you were inside and warm. David set down the report. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. Naomi set down the mending. She looked at him. Her expression was open and attentive, and he thought, very slightly braced, the way she braced herself whenever something important was approaching, with a readiness that was not fear but was a deep, hard-learned caution. "I'm not going to say this perfectly," he said. "I want you to know that ahead of time. I'm not a man who says things perfectly, but I'm going to say it as honestly as I can, and I'd rather say it honestly than say it well." "That seems right," she said, and her voice was very quiet. "In 6 weeks," he said, "this house has become something it wasn't before. And I don't mean the practical things, the good food and the organized root cellar and the garden being properly prepared, though all of that is real and I'm grateful for it. I mean that there is someone in this house now, and that matters to me in a way I hadn't anticipated and have been trying to figure out what to do about for some weeks now." She was absolutely still. "I'm not asking you to stay because I need a housekeeper," he said. "I'm asking you to stay because I want you here. I want to know what you're going to say next and what you think about things and what you want for your life. I want to plant peach trees with you in the spring. I want the herb garden to go wherever you think it should go." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out the ring and set it on the table between them, on top of the market price report, and it caught the lamplight and glowed a deep, warm red. I know it has been a very short time. I know that's a reasonable objection, and I'm not dismissing it. But I also think that sometimes you know what you know, and I know what I know about you. And what I know is that you are the most real person I have ever been in a room with, and I would very much like to spend the rest of my life in rooms with you. Naomi looked at the ring. She looked at it for a long time, and David waited because he was good at waiting, and because she deserved as much time as she needed to decide, and because rushing her now would undo everything he had just said. "David," she said finally. Her voice was steady, but her hands in her lap were not entirely still. "I have been alone in the world since I was 17 years old." "I know," he said. "I have learned not to rely on things that might disappear," she said. "I have learned to hold everything loosely because that is how you survive when you have nothing that can't be taken from you." "I know that too," he said. She looked up from the ring to his face. "You are asking me to hold something not loosely," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am." A long moment passed. The stove breathed and the wind moved outside and the lamp burned steadily, and David looked at Naomi Beckett across the table, and he did not let himself look away. "I'm frightened," she said with the simple directness that was entirely her own. "I want you to know that, not of you, of this, of wanting this much." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to not be frightened. I'm asking you to say yes anyway." She looked at the ring again. Then she looked at him, and something in her face shifted, the final closing of a long-held distance, like a door that had been standing slightly open finally coming the rest of the way open, warm light spilling through. "Yes," she said. He picked up the ring and reached across the table, and she gave him her left hand, and he slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit, which he had guessed at from looking at her hands, and which somehow seemed like a small confirmation of everything. Her hand was warm, and he held it for a moment after the ring was on it, and she turned her hand over so their fingers were interlaced, and she looked at the ring on her finger and then at him, and she was not crying, but her eyes were bright. "The peach trees," she said. "In spring." "In spring," he said. She laughed, and he laughed with her, and across the table with their hands joined in the lamplight. The wind pressed at the windows, and the stove burned warm and steady, and the house held them, solid and particular and entirely theirs. They married in December, in the small Methodist church in Myra Creek, on a day that was cold and clear and flooded with winter light. There were not many people there because they did not have many people, but those who came were genuine. The Reverend, a lanky, serious man named Foster who had known David for years, conducted the ceremony with brevity and warmth in equal measure. Alderman from the general store was there, and his wife. The Caldwell family from the neighboring property came, and their eldest daughter, a girl of about 12 named Ruth, who was enormously impressed by Naomi's dress, which was a deep blue wool that Naomi had ordered from a shop in San Marcos and made alterations to herself, taking in the waist and adding a collar of cream-colored lace that she had produced from the bottom of her carpet bag, with the air of someone who had been saving it for something important. David wore his best coat and a collar that Naomi had ironed 3 times until it was exactly right, and when he stood at the front of the church and watched her come up the aisle between the empty pews, he thought that whatever he had done or not done in his life to end up here, in this moment, it had all been right enough to bring him here, and that was more than enough. The Reverend spoke. They said the words. David put a plain gold band on Naomi's finger to companion the garnet ring, and she put a plain gold band on his finger, because she had gone to San Marcos herself the week before on the pretext of collecting something from the dressmaker, and had come back with the ring in her coat pocket, which David had not known about until the ceremony, and which made him love her so completely in that moment that he had briefly had to look at the ceiling of the church to collect himself. "You are husband and wife," Reverend Foster said with appropriate gravity. David looked at Naomi. She was smiling, the full, real, unguarded smile that he had been collecting since the first morning, and he kissed her, and the Caldwell children clapped. Outside the church in the winter light, with the cold making everyone's breath visible, Naomi stood with her hand in David's, and she looked at the blue sky over the plains and the pale gold of the winter grass and the solid shape of the church behind them, and she felt something settle in her chest that she had not known was unsettled, a deep, particular peace that came from having made a choice with her whole self, and having found that the choice was solid ground. They drove home in the wagon in the winter afternoon light, sitting close together against the cold, and when they came over the small rise and saw the ranch, the house and the barn and the corral with the horses moving in it, the whole spread of it in the long late light, Naomi said, "That's home." "Yes," David said, "it is." The winter they spent together was the best winter David had known in many years, and he suspected from things she said, the best Naomi had known in a very long time too. They were well suited to the particular rhythms of a ranch winter, the indoor work and the outdoor work and the long evenings, and they found that living closely together did not diminish what they were to each other but deepened it, because they were both honest people, and honest people are, on the whole, good to live with. Naomi had kept a small journal since she was young, a habit she'd maintained through the unsettled years on her own, brief practical notes at first, and then, as the years passed and the writing became more habitual, something more personal. She filled pages that winter with the kind of writing that doesn't know it will someday be read as joy, because the person writing it is still too close to it to have the perspective, still in the middle of the happiness and thinking of it as just the ordinary record of days. David fixed the southern fence in January and started planning, in February, the extension of the barn that would give them space for more horses and better shelter for the cattle in bad weather. He talked through the plans with Naomi at the table in the evenings, and she asked sharp, practical questions about costs and materials and timing, and her questions improved the plans every time, and he told her so, and she told him she was only pointing out the obvious, and he told her the obvious was worth pointing out clearly, and she smiled. They ordered the fruit trees in February from a nursery in Austin that sent a catalog. Naomi chose 3 peach trees and 1 pear, and she planned where each one would go with the same systematic attention she gave to everything, factoring in the direction of the prevailing winds and the drainage of the ground, and the amount of afternoon shade from the house. She drew a diagram of the garden on a piece of paper and pinned it to the kitchen wall, and David looked at it every morning over breakfast and felt something warm and domestic that he had always imagined having and had not been sure was ever going to be real. March arrived, and with it the beginning of spring work on the ranch, the long days of planting and calving and fence repair, and Naomi worked alongside David in the outdoor work more than he had expected, not from any particular necessity, but because she found the ranch genuinely interesting, and because she was the kind of person who preferred to understand things fully rather than partially. She learned to help with the cattle in the ways she could be useful, learned what to watch for in the calves and how to manage the feed, and what the different sounds the animals made meant. She was quick to learn and completely without self-consciousness about not knowing, which was one of the things David found most consistently admirable about her. The peach trees arrived in March, bundled in damp cloth, and they planted them together on a Saturday morning, both of them on their knees in the dark earth, careful with the young roots, and the morning was warm and the light was the specific gold of early Texas spring, and the whole event had a ceremonial quality. Neither of them said it, but both of them felt it, the sense of something being put into the ground for the long term, something that would grow and produce and be there in years to come. "It takes about 3 years for them to fruit properly," Naomi said, pressing the soil around the base of the 3rd tree. "We'll be here in 3 years," David said. She looked at him over the young tree, dirt on her hands and the spring wind moving a strand of hair across her face, and she smiled. "We will," she said. By April, Naomi knew she was expecting a child. She told David on an evening in late April, when the windows were open to the warm night, for the first time, since autumn and the creek sounds were coming through on the breeze. She told him directly, in the way she did everything, not building up to it but saying it clearly. And David sat very still for a moment, and then he put down what was in his hands and he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before, something open and young and undisguised. "When?" he asked. "October, I think," she said. He got up from his chair and he crossed the room and he took both her hands and he looked at her face and he said, "Naomi, are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I'm very well," she said, and she was smiling. "I'm actually quite remarkably well." He held her hands for a long moment. "October," he said, as if he were trying to make it real by saying it. "October," she confirmed. He brought her forehead to his, and they stood like that in the warm evening with the creak sounds coming through the window and both of them thinking about October. The summer of 1883 was long and hot in the way of Texas summers, the kind of heat that arrived in June and settled in as if it owned the place and intended to stay indefinitely. Naomi did not slow down appreciably, which frustrated David in a gentle, helpless way, because he worried, and she found his worrying somewhat endearing but also excessive, and told him so regularly. She did, under negotiation, agree to rest through the hottest part of the afternoon, a compromise reached after a Thursday in July when David came in at noon, and found her on the back step looking somewhat pale, and had said something about the heat and the work and his concern, in a voice that was so carefully reasonable that she recognized it as disguising genuine worry and took it seriously. In the hot afternoons while Naomi rested, David took over more of the indoor tasks than he would have otherwise, which was educational in ways he had not fully anticipated. He had never realized, before having the experience of trying to do what Naomi did, quite how much she managed and how well she managed it. He had known intellectually that she was competent. He understood now, on a much more practical level, what that competence actually looked like from the inside. He said this to her one evening and she laughed and said, "I could have told you that 6 months ago." "You could have," he agreed. "I'm glad I found out for myself." In August, with the heat beginning to finally relent and the first suggestions of autumn in the evening air, a letter arrived for Naomi through the Myra Creek post office. David brought it back from town with the other mail and set it in front of her at the table, and she looked at the handwriting on the front and her expression shifted in a way he could not immediately read. "It's from Mrs. Allard," she said, "in Wichita." She opened it and read it carefully, and then she set it on the table and looked out the window for a moment. "Tell me," David said. "She was a friend or close to it," Naomi said. "She knew me before in Wichita. She's asking how I am." She paused. "I didn't know she knew where I was. I wrote to her briefly from Myra Creek when we married, just to tell her that I was well." "Is something wrong?" "No," Naomi said slowly. "She's just writing to say that she heard about what happened with the Harmons. Gerald Harmon apparently has had complaints filed against him by another woman he employed after me." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad she reported it. I should have. I was too frightened of the consequences to do it myself, and I've thought about that." David reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You got yourself out," he said. "That was what you needed to do at the time." "I know," she said. "But the next woman didn't have that option because I didn't speak up." She squared her shoulders. "I'm going to write back and tell Mrs. Allard what happened with me so that if there are proceedings my account can be included." "I'll help you write it," he said. "I can write it myself," she said. "I know," he said, "but I'd like to help." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "Yes, I'd like that." They wrote the letter together that evening, sitting side by side at the table, and Naomi wrote in her clear, careful hand what had happened at the Harmon Ranch in as exact detail as she could. And David read it over and said it was good and true and clear. And Naomi sealed it, and David mailed it on his next trip to town. And that chapter of what had been taken from her was returned to some order, if not entirely undone. September came, and with it the particular beauty of a Texas autumn that David had come to love over his years here, the light going golden and the evenings cooling, and the cattle growing out their winter coats. Naomi was moving more carefully now, the pregnancy showing clearly, and she had accepted without much argument David's management of the heavier outdoor work, though she continued to oversee the household operations with complete authority. She had begun, in the evenings, to make small things, stitching together pieces of fabric with the focused pleasure of someone who was making something for a specific person, though the person did not yet exist in the world in any form that could be seen or known. David watched her from across the room and felt something large and quiet. One evening he said, "What do you hope for the baby?" She thought about it seriously, as she always did. "I hope for someone who is curious," she said, "who finds the world interesting, and I hope for their health." "And what do you want?" he asked. "A son or a daughter?" "A healthy child," she said firmly. "That is what I want." "That is the correct answer," he agreed, and she gave him a look of mild amusement. "What do you hope for?" she asked. "Someone who will let me teach them to ride," he said, and she laughed. The baby came on an early morning in the first week of October, 2 years almost to the day since Naomi had walked away from the Harmon Ranch with $3.40 and a bruised cheek and no idea where she was going. The midwife from Myra Creek, Mrs. Peterson, had been staying at the ranch for the last 3 days in anticipation. A practical, matter-of-fact woman in her 60s who had brought more babies into the world than she could count, and who had a manner so calm it was almost sedating. David stayed close. He was not particularly useful in the way of the medical or domestic aspects of the occasion, but he was there, and Naomi had said she wanted him there, which was the most important thing. In the early morning hours before the birth, when the work was hard and long, she held his hand with a grip that he would remember as one of the most honest forms of communication he had ever experienced, and he did not say anything except that she was the strongest person he had ever known, which was simply the truth. The baby was a boy. He arrived with a sound that was initially small and then increasingly definite, like an announcement, and Mrs. Peterson said, "A fine boy," and put him in Naomi's arms, and Naomi looked at him with the expression of someone who has just been confronted with an entirely new order of things and is rising to meet it, and then she looked at David. David was not entirely managing his face in that moment, and he did not try very hard to. "He looks like you," Naomi said. "Around the eyes." "He looks like himself," David said, which was what he mostly felt. They named him James, after no one in particular and both of them in general, because it was a solid, clear name that neither of them had anything against, and both of them found they could say with warmth. James Wilcox was born into a household that was already full, not of things particularly, but of the kind of living that makes a house into a home, the smell of cooking, and the sound of voices that spoke to each other with honesty and care, the habits of two people who had chosen each other with full awareness and had not once regretted it. The peach trees survived their first winter. In their second spring they bloomed, pink and white against the clear sky, and Naomi stood in the garden holding James on her hip, 4 months old and already showing signs of the alert, interested quality of attention that she had hoped for, and she looked at the blooming trees and then at David, who was leaning against the garden fence with the particular expression of uncomplicated contentment that she had learned to love most about him. "Next year," she said. "Real peaches." "Next year," he confirmed. That summer, David expanded the barn as he had planned, with help from the Caldwell men who came for 3 days in exchange for David's help with their own fence project. And by August, the new section was roofed and sound, and already being used for extra storage, and the 2 additional horses David had purchased from a breeder in the next county, a matched pair of working horses that were better suited to the expanding demands of the ranch. In September of 1884, a letter came from the county sheriff's office, copied from records in Abilene, informing Naomi that Gerald Harmon had been fined and formally censured for his treatment of domestic employees, and that her written account had been entered into the official record and cited in the proceedings. The letter was formal and brief, but it was real, and Naomi read it twice and then folded it carefully and put it in her journal, and that evening after supper when James was asleep she told David about it. "It doesn't undo anything," she said. "No," he agreed. "But it matters," she said, "that it's in the record, that it counted." "It counted," he said. She nodded once. "Good," she said, and then she poured more coffee and they talked about other things, and the letter was filed with the small but important records of her life, and it stayed there. James walked at 10 months, which was slightly early and which David took considerable pride in, as if he were personally responsible for it. He was a busy, interested child, the kind who wants to see everything and touch everything, and who regards any attempt to keep him in one place as a personal affront. Naomi managed him with a mixture of patience and structure that was, David observed, the same approach she brought to every other management challenge, and it worked just as well. In 1885, the year James turned 2, Naomi and David planted 6 more fruit trees, adding 2 apple trees to the peach and pear, and Naomi began a more serious kitchen garden in the plot she had originally cleared, planting in proper beds with paths between them, tending it with the same methodical pleasure she had always associated with the idea of a garden that was truly hers. The peach trees fruited that summer, the first real crop, and the peaches were golden and heavy and sweet, and Naomi made preserves and a peach cobbler and sliced some fresh for the table. And when she put a piece of the cobbler in front of David and he tasted it, he looked at her across the table with James in his lap smearing cobbler on himself enthusiastically, and he said, "Your mother would be proud." Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think she would." James managed to get cobbler on David's shirt, which required attention, and the moment moved on in the way that moments do in the middle of living, absorbed into the ongoing business of the day. But it stayed in both of them in the way that certain moments do, solid and particular, like something built to last. That autumn, in the long, clear October evenings that Naomi had come to regard as the most beautiful season of this land, she would sometimes sit on the porch after James was asleep and listen to the sounds of the ranch at night, the cattle and the creek and the occasional coyote, and think about the night 3 years ago when she had pushed open the door of this very barn and crawled in from the cold dark and had not known, could not have known, that she was pushing open a door into the rest of her life. She thought about the woman she had been on that road in the dark, walking south with $3.40 and a bruised cheek, and the bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been fighting to hold their ground for a very long time with no ground of their own to stand on. She thought about her, that woman, and felt for her something that was not pity but was something warmer and more complicated, a kind of tenderness, the feeling of wanting to tell her something across the distance of 3 years, not that it was going to be all right because she would not have believed it, but something simpler, something true. Keep walking, she thought. Keep walking because the road goes somewhere. She heard the door behind her and then David's weight on the porch boards, and he settled into the chair beside her the way he always did and looked out at the dark land and the clear sky thick with stars in the way of October. "James asked about the horses today," he said. "Again. He asks about them every day," Naomi said. "He wants to be on them. He's 2. He'll be 3 in a month," David said. "I started riding at 3. "You are going to teach him to ride the moment his feet can reach the stirrups, and we both know it," Naomi said. "Approximately," David agreed, without apology. She smiled and looked at the stars. He looked at the stars too. The creek sound was steady and low in the distance. "I have been thinking," Naomi said. "Tell me," he said, because that was what he always said. "James is going to need someone to grow up with," she said. "A sibling or 2. David turned to look at her. In the star and moonlight she was composed and specific and entirely real, the way she always was, and she was watching him with the hazel eyes that were darker in the night light, and there was a warmth in her expression that she had stopped being careful about a long time ago with him in the privacy of their own evenings. "Are you telling me something?" he asked. "Not yet," she said. "I'm telling you what I've been thinking. There's a difference." "That's a meaningful distinction," he said. "I find that meaningful distinctions matter," she said. He reached over and took her hand on the arm of the chair, and she turned her hand and held his back, the garnet ring cool against his fingers in the night air, and they sat in the quiet of the autumn night and listened to the creek and the cattle and the particular silence of land that was theirs. By winter's end, Naomi's thinking had become a reality, and by the following October there were 2 children in the house, James Wilcox, 3 years old and obsessed with horses and already convinced that he was considerably older than he was, and Eleanor Wilcox, named after David's mother, who arrived in the world in October with a directness and volume that suggested she intended to be heard, and who had her mother's eyes, the clear hazel that shifted with the light, and her father's dark hair, and who was, from the first days, thoroughly herself. The house that David had built from one room and a sleeping loft held them all. It had grown over the years, the way living things grow, adding a room here and a porch there, and it was full now in the best way, not cramped but occupied, alive with the evidence of people who lived in it fully and with intention. There were children's shoes by the door and a cradle in the corner and books on the shelf and Naomi's journal on the table and David's boots next to hers in the entryway. In the evenings after the children were in bed, Naomi and David sat in the main room in the light of the lamp, in the chairs they had claimed as their own over the years, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they read, and sometimes they simply sat in the particular silence of 2 people who do not need to fill the air to be together. And the stove burned, and the night moved outside the windows, and the house held everything that mattered. Naomi would sometimes look up from whatever she was doing and find David looking at her, not the covert glancing of the early days but the open, unhurried looking of a man who has nothing to hide and nowhere to look he'd rather be, and she would look back at him with the same openness, and it was still, years into it, one of the most sustaining things she had ever known. The garden grew. The peach trees were producing well now, their 3rd and 4th seasons of real fruit, heavy and golden in the summer heat. The herb garden along the south side of the house was thriving, and Naomi kept it tended with the same regular attention she had brought to everything since the beginning. She had planted roses, too, along the fence line near the gate, because she had decided that beauty was a reasonable thing to cultivate alongside the practical, and the roses had surprised her by thriving. James Wilcox got his first riding lesson at 3½, on the small roan mare who had been in the barn the night Naomi arrived, and who had, over the years, become the most reliable and gentle of all their horses. He sat on the mare's back with David's hand steadying him, looking extremely serious, and Naomi stood at the fence and watched them with her hand shading her eyes from the afternoon sun, and she thought, "This is mine. All of this is mine." Not in the sense of property or possession, exactly, though the land was hers too now, Naomi and David Wilcox. The deed had been updated when they married. But mine in the sense of belonging to, and belonging being mutual, a thing you were part of because it was part of you, because you had put your hands into it, and your time and your love, and it had put its hands into you right back. She had told him once in the 2nd year, lying awake in the winter dark while the wind was up, that she still sometimes felt the old wariness, the waiting for things to be taken. He had been quiet for a moment, and then he had said that he thought she probably would for a while, because that kind of wariness did not undo itself quickly, and that was all right, and she could wake him whenever she felt it and they would sit with it together. And she had occasionally done exactly that, and he had without fail sat with her, and over time the wariness had loosened its grip. Not entirely, maybe not ever entirely, but enough that she stopped waiting for the ground to shift, stopped bracing for the loss, started trusting the weight of what was real. In the spring of 1887, David and Naomi stood in the garden in the early morning and looked at the trees and the garden beds and the house beyond them, the solid, particular shape of it against the clear spring sky, and James was chasing a leaner between the beds in a way that would require Naomi's intervention in approximately 30 seconds, and the coffee was hot in their hands, and the morning was quiet and bright and new. "We should put in another apple tree," Naomi said. "Over there on the east side, The light is better. You just want more apples, David said. I want more apples, she confirmed, without any indication that she found this a less than sufficient reason. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him briefly, the unself-conscious comfort of two people who have gotten used to each other's weight, and they looked at the garden and the trees and the children and the house and the sky, and the morning expanded around them, wide and warm and full. James ran into Alina, and both of them went down in the garden path, and Alina's protests were immediate and considerable. Naomi handed David her coffee and went to manage the situation with the efficiency and patience that she brought to everything, and David watched her crouch down to James's level and speak to him, and James looked mortified and then apologetic, and Alina was appeased, and within 2 minutes the two children were walking together toward the barn to look at the horses, which was James's preferred resolution to any morning disagreement. Naomi came back and reclaimed her coffee from David, and they watched the children go. Another apple tree, David said. At least one, she said. We'd better order it before the catalogs are picked over, he said. I'll write to the nursery this week, she said. The morning moved forward in the way of mornings, toward the work of the day, and the work of the day moved forward into the week and the month and the season, and the seasons turned in the ordered rhythm of a ranch life that was full and hard and good, and the creek ran along the east edge of the property, and the peaches ripened every summer, and the cattle grew their winter coats every fall, and the children grew taller every year, and the house held everything. The lamp and the books and the boots by the door and the roses along the fence, and the two people at the center of it who had found each other at the beginning of a cold October night, the woman with no place to go and the man who gave her one, and had built from that particular beginning something so completely whole and real that it had long since ceased to be surprising and had become simply what was true. There was a night a few years on when Naomi sat at the table late after the children were long asleep and David was beside her reading, and she had been writing in her journal, the habit of years, and she stopped and put down her pencil and looked at what she had written, and what she had written that particular evening was simply, I am home. She looked at the two words for a long moment. Then she closed the journal and set it on the table, and she looked at David reading beside her in the lamplight, his brown eyes moving across the page, his hand around his coffee cup, the solid, particular presence of him that she had been building her days around for years now, and that she intended to build her days around for all the years to come, however many there were, and she felt the absolute truth of what she had written settle through her like warm water. She was home. She had found it, or it had found her, in the middle of a dark October road and a barn full of hay and a stranger's canvas coat laid over her sleeping shoulders, and she had built it from there with both hands and everything she had, and it was real and it was hers and it was not going anywhere. David looked up from his book and found her watching him, and he looked back, open and unhurried. What are you thinking? He asked. That I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, she said. He put down his book and reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and the lamplight held them warm, and outside the window the Texas night was wide and dark and full of stars, and the creek murmured along the east edge of the land, and the peach trees stood silver in the moonlight in the garden she had planned and planted and tended, and the house breathed around them, solid and particular and completely, permanently, entirely theirs.